Hello and a very warm welcome. Another week, another vote. Actually, multiple votes in the British Parliament over Brexit. And a sort of miracle, the MPs finally starting to compromise to some extent. So who is more terrified of a no-deal Brexit, the UK or those on the other side of the Channel? In this roundtable, we look at what the EU is really scared of. Good to have you with us. I'm David Foster. Sitting here in London, you would be forgiven for thinking that the UK has the most to lose if March the 29th comes and there's a really ugly European divorce. But is that really the case?
Back to Brussels yet again. This time Prime Minister Theresa May has a stronger mandate, but will anyone listen? The protracted negotiations have meant industry and business have had to plan for multiple outcomes. In Europe, countries are also concerned about what comes next. More than 20 leading figures from across German society have appealed to the UK to abandon Brexit. Portugal has made special arrangements for UK tourists to enjoy fast-track access with or without a deal. And with 1 million of its nationals in the UK, Poland has a crucial stake in making sure that a withdrawal treaty is agreed to protect its citizens' rights. Will the EU bend for Brexit or leave Britain to clean up its own mess?
Let us get talking to the Netherlands. First of all, Patrick Bijsmans is there. He's from Maastricht University, city of that famous or infamous EU treaty, depending on how you view it. With me at the round table, Denis MacShane, a former UK Minister for Europe. Russell Foster's here too, from King's College London, a friend of this programme on Brexit and other major issues. And Roch, Dunin-Wąsowicz, a sociologist at University College London, who happens to be Polish and, Roch, British. Yeah. Okay, we're going to go over the Channel first of all to you, Patrick. I have got very few notes. Normally, this book is filled with them, but I want to find out the general opinions first of all. Does the EU collectively have a lot to lose if there's no deal, or does it depend on which country you come from?
I think the EU as a whole has something to lose, namely when it comes to things like free trade, etc., etc. But I think also some of the individual states have something to lose. Think indeed of the Polish people who live in Brussels, in the UK. But we see similar talks also about British citizens living in Europe and in other countries also, nationals living in the UK. What's going to happen to them? Student mobility, and many, many different things which I think people are worrying about and governments are worrying about.
Yeah, when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to the jobs in their own countries, are they worried about what they might no longer be able to shift to the UK? And if so, what sectors and where?
There's a lot of debate on how to prepare for Brexit at this stage. And what is going to happen, no one knows. Will there be lots of documents to be filled in, long queues at customs? If you look at the Netherlands, there are all kinds of produce which are shipped to the UK right now, which might be stopped or not. And a lot of this also depends on fast shipping. These things need to be fresh in your supermarket. And obviously, as soon as there are queues, this whole system starts to collapse.
But collectively, anybody at this table, collectively, what does the EU stand to lose if there's no deal, apart from some credibility, which is pretty important, but what do you think it stands to lose? Roch, do you want to kick off?
I think the upcoming European elections are something to watch out for. I think it would be quite disastrous for the main political parties, the EPP and the Socialists in the European Parliament, to have a no-deal Brexit on their hands while they're trying to retain their majority in the European Parliament. It would be also tarnish the legacy of the outgoing presidents of both the Council and the Commission. So I think that we have to look to May, the month. Which
of yes, as opposed to the lady in charge of this country. So that follows Britain's departure from the European Union if the current timetable is followed. So do you think something is definitely, is it in the interest of the European Union to make sure that something happens?
I think it's in the interest of the European Union to have this issue behind them while the European Parliament election campaigns are happening in their respective member states. But at the same time, those campaigns usually center around local and domestic issues. So while this could be used to prop up the populist vote on a certain level, I think ultimately it will be down to what's happening within the individual member states.
You say you
May
don't.
I
Yeah, of course.
very slightly, Proshpari, disagree in the sense that in the European Parliament elections, one of the biggest arguments from what you might call the establishment parties is, look what happens in Britain when you let the anti-Europeans win. If you want to vote for Marine Le Pen or give Salvini a giant majority or the AfD or the Swedish Democrats, this is the direction of travel. Chaos, impoverishment, bad politics. Let's stick together. So I actually think, and you were seeing this already today, the Italian government said, we're not for a second thinking of leaving the euro, whereas Mr. Salvini and Mr. Di Maio from the other populist party in the coalition, for years have been saying, let's get out of the euro, let's get out of the EU. So they've killed, I mean, Brexit has killed off that part of anti-Europeanism. I mean, I very much agree with you. I think the European Parliament elections will be popularity contests for Kaczynski, for Macron, etc., etc. But it won't, I don't think, Brexit as such is going to do anything other than support those who say, let's stick together.
But a response to that is that although traditional Eurosceptic movements in France, in Germany, in Hungary, although they have dropped their rhetoric of leaving the Eurozone or leaving the European Union, what we're seeing is these so-called populist movements. I don't like calling them populist because that's a word which has so little meaning.
Exactly.
But they are now pushing not to leave Europe, but to take control of the mechanisms and structures of the European project. We've seen this in Italy, we've seen it in Hungary. They don't want to leave, they want to transform the EU from within into a civilization, or a more imperial civilization.
So how could they make the most, forget whether you like the word populist or not, but these movements, how could they make the most of a no-deal?
It's going to be very easy for them to capitalise if and when there is a no-deal Brexit, and if and when the pain does come. They'll be able to capitalise on this by saying that negotiations were botched or sabotaged by a very reluctant Remainer elite. All of this resentment that we've seen in Europe since 2016, the year of elections in 2017, the rise of populist Eurosceptic movements, just because they didn't win in all European countries doesn't mean that that sentiment has gone away.
Patrick, Maastricht, the treaty,
Yeah.
it caused a lot of resentment in this country. It was probably one of the first times that the population had heard of the deep discontent that there was governmentally over some aspects of the European Union. People of a certain age. Dennis is disagreeing with me there.
Well, the 83 election, the Labour Party manifesto in 1983 was to withdraw from Europe. It's a complete myth that European hostility in this country and most of the rest of Europe only began with Maastricht or maybe Juncker or Lisbon.
I'm simply talking about
myth.
in the larger populace. It became synonymous with the bad Europe, the word Maastricht. We can disagree about that.
Yeah.
Patrick, I don't know whether the city's proud of its place in history, but what about Holland, the Netherlands as a whole? How will it go about its business if there is no deal? Does it make, other than from the fruit and veg and flowers that you talked about, what difference does it make?
I think a lot of people, a lot of politicians are also happy to move on. I think everyone is waiting for a resolvement of the situation, and almost to an extent that, let's have a no deal, although no one wants to. I think the general opinion is it would be great if the UK would stay. People are still hoping, including some politicians, that perhaps things will turn around. We don't know what's going to happen now. So it might as well go towards a referendum, who knows, and maybe people will stay, or the UK will stay. But I think generally also, as Denis has just said, this whole feeling of criticism towards the EU, even hostility towards the EU, not only in the UK, but also in the Netherlands and also many other countries, has been around for quite some time. And it's going to be interesting to see indeed if there's a deal or not, and if the UK will stay.
And has all this chatter, I mean, and there's so much chatter in this country, has all this chatter made that, has stoked the fires, if you like?
Not really. I think, to be quite honest, people are a bit bored about Brexit. It's been going on for so long. I was watching the debate yesterday evening on television, and you just have a feeling of steps being repeated, and the same things happening on and on and on. And I think it's just something that doesn't seem to end. And then I would disagree with Russell, because I think if there is a no deal, it might also be a positive thing for the pro-European parties, because, you know, no deal, there will be a mess. What kind of mess, no one really knows. And the extent to which it will be a mess, no one also knows. But still, we're in a situation that both the pro and the anti-European parties may capitalize on this.
I know you want to say something, Dennis. I'm going to bring you in at this point, because I'm going to talk about, we say it's going on and on and on. Yeah. You wrote How Britain Left Europe. That was a couple of years ago, but you're now writing Brexiternity.
It's my new word. I was one of the first to use the word Brexit in 2012. I predicted in a book in January 2015, Brexit, How Britain Will Leave Europe. I couldn't find a single academic, a single journalist, a single minister who would believe me. I said, guys, if you have a populist plebiscite, it's out. Every referendum elsewhere in Europe this century has been lost. Anyway, Brexiternity is, let's assume we get to Mrs. May's deal. I've analysed all 147 paragraphs of the political declaration, and there's at least 10 years of negotiation in there. We're going to be stuck with this. It's going to divide parties down the middle. Great work for distinguished professors, for journalists and all the rest of it. But the country will be in total stasis for at least a decade. You know, didn't happen yesterday that they passed two completely contradictory motions and sent Mrs. May back.
Which about sitting on a potty is probably apposite.
They sent poor Mrs. May back you know, with a fresh set of nappies. And by the way, Britain imports all its soft tissue paper. We're one day's stock of loo paper in this country. So if those queues start forming at Dover, we will be in
Now, we could get very puerile at this point. So let me turn the conversation to particular countries. Yeah, British, Polish citizen. And Donald Tusk, Polish, of course, you know, the man who sort of says there will be no change. But the vibrations coming out of Poland are perhaps that it's going to break ranks here. What does that say to you?
Poland's in a very particular situation. If we look back to 2015, when the Law and Justice government was first formed, Britain was heralded as the prime ally of Poland in the European Union. And obviously 2016 has changed that architecture of power within the EU. So the government in Poland, in Warsaw, had found itself scrambling for allies. So yes, the Warsaw has been at odds with the Commission over the rule of law proceedings. So they are asserting their independence to an extent. But at the same time, as our colleague from Maastricht has mentioned, there are over 1 million Polish people living in the United Kingdom. Polish is the second most commonly spoken language in the UK.
And there is a very close bond going back 70, 80 years, perhaps even further, between the UK and Poland.
Definitely since the Second World War. So I think that Warsaw is very much keen on preserving that relationship and preserving the well-being of Polish citizens.
And will it do so at the expense of a good relationship, perhaps with the other members of the European Union? Because if it seemed to break ranks, I mean, there could be some cracks.
Even for a seemingly Eurosceptic government like the one in Warsaw, which, as has been pointed out, wants to take over the European Union, not dissolve it. Brexit has been a realization about the geopolitical situation of Poland and how much of its security depends on economic cooperation rather than just NATO. So as much as Law and Justice are somewhat skeptical of how the EU is run today, they are very far from jeopardizing Poland's geopolitical position.
So better the devil you know than the one you don't know.
But also, David, I mean, Mr. Kaczynski, his greatest passion, I hope I'm right in saying, is sort of hostility to Moscow and Mr. Putin. Who's Mr. Putin's biggest friends in Europe? It's Marine Le Pen, Matteo Salvini, and Viktor Orban. So the moment you talk about the right taking over Europe, the right is much, much more broken apart and opposed to each other on so many core issues. I mean, I agree, I go to Poland a bit. I've got some Polish background. I wrote the first book on solidarity in English in 1981. The Peace Party wants to bang, bang, bang on Brussels. Poland itself, the business community, the teachers, and the opposition party, which is sort of making a little bit of a comeback, they're pretty pro-European.
as is the society. So Poland has the most pro-European society in the European Union, and part of it is the successful merging of the national narrative with the European narrative.
So the narrative that comes out at the moment that Poland might be a bit wobbly on this is not correct, in your opinion. What about, I don't know, you pick a country, but I'll pick Portugal. Yeah. Because it's been talking about, you know, healthcare for Brits living there, better rates on holidays, you can stay if you, it's making nice sounds towards
Yes, yes. Well, this is an example of how the dragging Brexit negotiations could splinter into negotiations not between the UK and the EU, but between the UK and the 27 individual nations that make up the EU. We saw glimmers of this at the time of in the immediate aftermath of the referendum, when there were questions of what's going to happen with EU citizens in the UK and with British citizens in the EU. And the EU's response was, well, that's a matter for individual countries. We've since then, we've also seen evidence from France, from the Netherlands, from Germany, from Portugal, of countries making bespoke deals or hinting at bespoke deals with the British. The Irish are maybe the strongest example of this. So as much as we do have Brexit fatigue, Brexhaustion, Brexiternity, which is a new word I'm going to have to steal for my lectures, even though it's dragging on, and
he'll charge you.
Oh, definitely.
No, free. For the academic world, free.
Even though these negotiations are dragging, everyone's tired of them, this isn't necessarily a sign that it's going to become quite calm and placid. I completely agree with Mr. MacShane that there are multiple different rights and far rights. The research I'm doing now at King's College is looking into how there isn't a single right. But the more that it drags on, the more it provides fuel for these movements of people who have already got economic grievances, who are concerned about their identity, who were worried about losing control in this nebulous but very emotional way. So the more it drags on, the greater the danger that the people who will profit from this will be very unsavoury factions.
So is it wrong of the newspapers to say these countries or the European Union as an institution is getting wobbly by citing examples of Poland and Portugal? Do you think that will have no bearing on what happens, gosh, in less than 2 months?
Oh no, it'll have a major bearing.
On what happens in the immediate future, not just the longer term?
In the immediate future, I don't think anything can be changed in the immediate future. As much as Theresa May says that she'll try to renegotiate a better deal, it's not going to happen. We've run out of time. It looks almost certain that we're going to have a no-deal Brexit or some sort of an extension on condition that we have another vote. Just as nothing is getting done in British politics because of the enormity of Brexit, equally the EU Commission has got limited time and resources to deal with other things. But a potential issue here is that a lot of the work I've been doing and shared by my colleagues here is how we tend to talk about Europe and the EU as though they're the same thing. And journalists, academics, politicians, we all do it. We all use this synecdoche of saying Europe to describe the EU as a single organisation with a single agenda. There's been a lot of talk about how instead of one powerful nation negotiating against 27 over Brexit, the EU has behaved like one nation and we've behaved like a squabbling bunch of children in our negotiations. As much as it's tempting to look at the EU as a single actor with a single agenda, they really haven't. And the longer that this drags on, the more likely that individual states are going to say, we'll cut our own deal, regardless of the Commission.
Well, only up to a point. I mean, they're all bound together under treaty law. We do forget the EU is a community based on laws. You obey laws in Europe, you obey them in Britain on the whole. So you can certainly do some deals. You mentioned Ireland, Russ, but Ireland for 100 years has had no frontier controls and Irish citizens coming here. Yesterday, the European Parliament adopted a very interesting policy saying that all British citizens should be able to come to Europe freely, without visas, without border checks, which, you know, is very welcome. I was talking to a tourism industry conference yesterday in the south of France. They love that idea, but on condition it's the same deal for Europeans. But we're just bringing in immigration law, which will put huge bureaucratic barriers. You'll have to have visas, there'll be controls of all sorts, as if we're treating all European citizens as if they were coming from
that's sort of
Turkey's
headline
way.
writers. I'm not sure it's going to happen. Patrick, you're nodding.
It's a bill, David. I wouldn't ignore bills put to Parliament, launched in Parliament.
Patrick, you were nodding.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of things going on in terms of citizens, but also tourists. We already heard that. Don't forget students moving to UK universities the other way around. I think there's a lot at stake here in terms of trying to find a solution for this. And I do think that the general feeling will be is, okay, we give you this, you give us this back. But I think that the main interesting thing will be the moment after Brexit has happened, because if there's a deal or if there's no deal, there will also be talk about the future of UK-EU relations. And I think if we are going to see the EU squabbling amongst each other, it will be after that moment, because what should that deal with the UK look like? What will be the trade deal? Will we do something on defense? And so on and so forth.
Dennis?
I'm slightly unconvinced by that. I mean, all my life, and almost the first thing that happened to me after I could vote, we had the first referendum in England, David. Well, you're too young to remember.
No, I do remember it. I do.
And we've been told endlessly Europe's about to collapse. The euro won't survive 5 minutes. You had the famous British civil servant sent to the meeting that set up the Treaty of Rome, the first common market. He said, gentlemen, what you'll propose will not get off the ground. If it does, it won't last long, and if it manages to stagger on for a bit, it'll have to be put out of its ministry. England won't participate. Good day.
Yeah, well,
we've been saying the same thing now.
But it brings to mind
later.
that famous headline or quote or whatever it is. You know, fog in Channel, Europe cut off. I mean, 5 years from now, do you think this will be a forgotten argument, and Britain and Europe will have managed to sort something out? Or will it be the picture that Denis paints?
I think we're definitely moving away from top-down integration via treaties. I think what happened last week with the Treaty of Aachen signed between Germany and France was a sign of this, that this kind of differentiated integration may happen on different levels. But at the same time, even the Eurosceptics have a vested interest in the EU's continued existence. As I mentioned before, Poland vis-à-vis Russia, the Baltic states have adopted the euro mostly for geopolitical reasons rather than economic ones. Even Viktor Orban, who is Eurosceptic, he wants to defend a Christian Europe, and he's absolutely dependent on EU structural funds. And that list continues. So in terms of what the next 5 years or so will bring is perhaps more integration on different levels. Definitely no top-down integration.
And will there come a time when the European Union thinks it really doesn't matter that Britain's no longer part of it?
Eventually there will. I mean, to go back to what Denis and Roch were just saying there, we've been talking about the crisis of the European Union so much and for so long that it's lost all meaning. We talk about the migration crisis, the Eurozone crisis, the Brexit crisis, the Crimea crisis. Maybe crisis is the default setting of the European project, because as much as it lurches from one disaster to the next, it always manages to survive, albeit in a slightly different form. So I would revise the predictions that I made on this very show a year ago, that I thought that the EU wouldn't exist by the 2030s. It will, but it won't be the same European Union.
Okay, so what's made you change your mind?
Because it has survived quite well in its biggest crisis so far.
And this was what I was trying to get to at a particular point. We don't have very much longer. Has this strengthened the European Union as an institution rather perhaps than weakened it?
I think it's asked serious questions of it, but frankly, in the 1970s, the economics of Europe was far worse. In the 1960s, General de Gaulle refused even to participate in European Council meetings, which was a far greater challenge. So there's actually a common sense that the best way forward for Polish national identity, and actually joining the European Union, has strengthened the nations of Europe. Small countries like Poland, Estonia, you mentioned them, others, Hungary, are much more confident now in their culture, their language, their nationality, their ability to have top people running things in Europe. It's been the most wonderful springtime of national confidence. Well, what I would say, though, for us...
No, sorry, Denis, we haven't got much time.
Okay.
Quick word from Europe. Patrick, stronger after this than before, perhaps surprisingly. What do you say?
On the whole, I would say stronger, because just after the Brexit vote, everyone said the EU will not be able to deal with this in a unified way, and they've been able to do so. The UK leaving the EU might, on some other points, make the EU less stronger. I'm thinking particularly about defense.
Okay, quick final thought.
Last year's Eurobarometer poll says that 68% of the European public think that membership of their country in the EU is a positive thing. It's the highest percentage since 1983. So in terms of how the publics are perceiving this, there is a Brexit effect. And it's positive for the European Union.
Brexit does seem to be making the EU stronger, but let's not start celebrating yet, because as everyone here has stated, the big test is going to come after Brexit Day.
And are we talking about May?
We're talking about May, June,
when
5 years from now, because the root causes of Brexit are far from unique to Britain, and it's only a matter of time until they crop up in another country.
All right, listen, thank you very much indeed. Dennis, I'm so sorry I kept having to do that. I'm getting timings in my ear, and I know you've got so much to say. Patrick, also, many thanks to you and to Roch and to Russell. Russell, thank you very much once again. Appreciate your time, every one of you, and appreciate you for watching this programme. I suppose there might have been a bit of a cry from Mrs May. It's behind you, well, to some extent, but not completely. But this being pantomime season in the UK, not just in theatres, but also perhaps in Parliament, the other cry would have been, oh no, it isn't. Goodbye for now.